This is the second of two presentations about communication. The first focused on the challenges faced by non-native speakers of English and the ways that they can be supported and encouraged by their colleagues and others. This second part considers the barriers to good communication and offers some ways to understand and overcome them. 45 years ago, the Merison Report was published. As shown here, the Merison Report proved to be a key shaper of the Medical Regulation Act of 1978, which made the GMC more accountable and extended its functions, particularly in relation to medical education. It would be surprising if doctors from overseas did not lack knowledge of the operation of the NHS, did not find difficulty in understanding the significance of the euphemisms and colloquialisms which for many patients are their most accurate means of expression, and even more surprising if they could easily come to grips with the variety of dialects they may encounter. This led to the introduction of a new method to assess clinical and language skills, the Temporary Registration Assessments Board, which finally developed into the Professional Linguistics and Assessments Board test of 1978. The report continued, as the satisfactory practice of medicine requires knowledge of language and culture, overseas graduates require time to become familiar with practice in the UK, particularly when their training in medical school was not in English. Even when English is the medium of instruction, the language learnt may vary from its day-to-day use by reasons of grammar, phrases, and idioms. The GMC report neatly summarizes the issues as ranging from difficulties with subtleties of language and dialect to misunderstandings of the nuances of non-verbal communication and social and behavioral norms. Communication, a two-way process, is affected by the patient's understanding, which in turn is influenced by his or her social and educational background and local dialect, subtleties which the overseas doctor may not be in a position to fully understand. The corollary is that the patient too needs to be aware of a non-UK graduate's own limitations in this area. Shortcomings on either side lead to weaknesses in how a doctor takes a patient's history, explains management plans, and when handing over care to another doctor. Yet more complexities arise when non-verbal gestures matter, such as eye contact, facial expression, or body language, which hold cultural clues which may be misinterpreted. A particular difficulty is when discussing sensitive issues, such as a sexual history, and problems of a different sort when breaking bad news. Healthy English is a website that has been created by the East Cheshire NHS Trust at Macclesfield Hospital. This resource has been developed to address the language and communication needs of international health and care staff and their colleagues working in the UK. The site is not exclusively for the use of non-native speakers. We are all responsible for making sure that communication, particularly speaking and listening, is optimal at all times. The site can be used for self-study and as part of training programs. So, working in another language from one's mother tongue, in a different culture, in a different country, and region of that country, is always going to be a challenge. Over recent weeks and months, the differing responses of countries around the world to the COVID-19 pandemic has been fascinating and sometimes disconcerting to observe. This was published on the 29th of July. The Dutch government on Wednesday said it will not advise the public to wear masks to slow the spread of coronavirus, asserting that their effectiveness has not been proven. The Dutch who do wear face masks do so mainly to avoid being infected. That requires an FFP2 mask. What links Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Sweden, Norway, and Finland is more likely the spirit of collectivism and respect for authority which characterizes these cultures. People there wear face masks to protect themselves, and maybe even more predominantly so as not to infect others. A simple face mask does actually help with that. Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory is a framework for cross-cultural communication developed by Gerd Hofstede, who died earlier this year. It shows the effects of a society's culture on the values of its members and how these values relate to behavior, using a structure derived from factor analysis. Generalizations about one country's culture are helpful, but they have to be regarded as such, that is, guidelines for a better understanding. Here are the categories for the model. The last one, indulgence and restraint, was added in 2010. Individualism versus collectivism. Some societies value the performance of individuals. For others, it's more important to value the performance of the team. Power distance. A high power distance score represents a culture that accepts and encourages bureaucracy and has a high respect for authority and rank. A lower power distance score represents a culture that encourages flatter organizational structures and places a greater emphasis on personal responsibility and autonomy. Short-termism versus long-termism. The key implication of this category is the impact on investment, planning, decisions, and risk-taking. Short-term perspective is biased towards a period of just a few months or years. Longer-term perspective is likely to encourage more long-term thinking. Masculine versus feminine. These refer to decision-making styles. A so-called masculine approach involves a hard-edged, fact-based, and aggressive style to decision-making. A so-called feminine approach to decision-making involves a much greater degree of consultation and intuitive analysis. Uncertainty avoidance. This category essentially considers the different attitudes to risk-taking. Low levels indicate a willingness to accept more risk, work outside the rules, and embrace change. Higher levels represent more support for rules, data, clarity of roles and responsibilities. Indulgence versus restraint. Indulgence stands for a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun. Restraint stands for a society that suppresses gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms. Look at the individualism indicator related to China and the US on this slide. Look at the uncertainty avoidance indicator between France and UK on this slide. Look at the power distance indicator and the masculinity versus femininity indicator regarding Sweden versus Qatar or India on this slide. International medical graduates reporting in a report about the study conducted in 2015 in the southern counties of Kent, Surrey and Sussex said that some of the major challenges they faced were the different learning environment in the UK, difficulty with receiving feedback, the feeling of being undervalued by colleagues, and communication skills. In challenging situations, such as end of life and resuscitation decisions, difficult patients, angry patients, patients with language difficulties, including non-native speakers, understanding local accents and dialects, communication skills in team working, and when dealing with medical emergencies and handling ethical scenarios. Generally speaking, we will use written communication for these reasons and under these circumstances. When conveying facts, the message needs to become part of a permanent file. There is little time urgency. You don't need immediate feedback. The ideas are complicated. Verbal communication, which is ephemeral unless we're recording it, is more likely to be used in these situations. When conveying emotion and feelings, the message does not need to be permanent. There is time urgency. You need immediate feedback. The ideas are simple or can be made simple with explanations. When we're speaking, the success of our communication will depend on a number of factors. Volume and tone, simply how loudly we're speaking, and the character or attitude that we convey by the way that we speak. Syntax, the construction and word order of our sentences. The diction, which will include the choice of words and phrases and the style of enunciation. Emphasis, the stress on words to indicate particular importance. Distance, literally how far away we are from our listeners, including using different forms of media. Pronunciation, which will include stress, intonation, accent, and differences of vowel pronunciation especially. Context. We construct meaning from the context, situational and linguistic, of the words as they're spoken. Inflection. Changing the form of a word to express a grammatical function, and the modulation of intonation and pitch. Vocabulary and interpretation. How we explain the meaning of something by our choice of words. By contrast, when communicating non-verbally, elements such as these will come into play. In many ways, these are more subtle and require more skill to use and interpret well. Facial expressions. Posture. What is often referred to as aura or vibe, how you visually interpret an individual's energetic state, and the distinctive atmosphere associated with the way people convey attitude and feeling. Emotion. Context. Interpretation. Eye contact. And of course, written. Let's look at some of the barriers to good communication. In communication studies and information theory, noise refers to anything that interferes with the communication process between a speaker and an audience. It's also called interference. Noise can be external, a physical sound, or internal, a mental disturbance, and it can disrupt communication process at any point. Personal. We're influenced by language, background, culture, status, personality, character, individual skill, interests, and much more. These can get in the way of clear, unambiguous, sympathetic, complete, and comprehensible communication. Semantics refers to specific meanings of a word, especially in academic circles. Semantic barriers, therefore, are the misunderstandings that occur by people trying to communicate an idea, but simultaneously having completely different meanings in mind for the words being used. The box is in back of the house, American English. The box is behind the house, British English. Can you give me a ride? Can you give me a lift? She got in the elevator. She got in the lift. He was wearing suspenders. He was wearing braces. Denotations and connotations. These were mentioned in the first part of this talk and often refer to the literal versus the metaphorical meaning of a word. Denotations also refer to words spelt or pronounced in the same way. People within high context cultures tend to be more aware and observant of facial expressions, body language, changes in tone, and other aspects of communication that are not directly spoken. By contrast, people in low context cultures communicate in a more direct way, explicitly speaking what they want to communicate. Status barriers. This is a kind of filtering. Some people regard status as very important to themselves and are very selective about what information they convey to their subordinates and juniors. In a similar way, people lower down the hierarchy often tell superiors what they think the superiors want to hear. Organizational. The larger an organization is, and the amount of management layering that's present, the greater the possibility of communication being compromised or distorted. Often, the mismatch between what is needed and what actually happens is very noticeable. Here is the tree swing. How the customer explained it. How the project leader understood it. How the engineer designed it. How the programmer wrote it. How the sales executive described it. How the project was documented. What operations installed. How the customer was billed. How the help desk supported it. What the customer really needed. Inadequate attention. In healthcare settings, colleges, schools, business enterprises, and other organizations, failure to read bulletins, notices, reports, and minutes is quite common. This is not just because of laziness or lack of concentration or time. We simply often don't see things that are there because we fail to focus on every word. We don't read word followed by the next word. We scan text. Our eyes are moving up and down and looking forward and backward and predicting what is coming next. Since jumps might cover the same word or words at each end of a line, Apparent replications are probably filtered out. We overlook lots of errors, which is why proofreading is hard. The next slide will be shown to you for 5 seconds. Did you notice the repeated the? In this sentence, by the time you are done reading, you will have already skipped over the double the. I love Paris in the springtime. We have 3 visual regions: foveal, parafoveal, and peripheral. This is how they apply to reading. The foveal, the point of fixation where you're able to see clearly and process details, enables you to perceive only about 3 to 6 letters. The parafoveal, the region directly surrounding the foveal region, enables you to perceive about 24 to 30 letters, but not very clearly. Without some sort of context, the strings of letters here are indistinguishable. The peripheral region is everything else. Here, you're able to perceive only gross shapes, not individual letters. We use the information contained in our neural networks, along with the context of what we're reading, and the grammar and the word order, to make predictions about the upcoming text. These predictions enable us to make sense of the semi-blurred letters found in the parafoveal regions and to recognize words quickly as we're reading. If we're reading efficiently, we don't process every letter in a word or every word in a sentence. Rather, we recognize words using semantics and syntax with minimal letter cues. Because we're creating meaning with print, our brain only tricks us into thinking we've looked at every letter in every word. Here, the saccades are rapid eye movements, fixations are focusing on words and letters, and regressions are moving backwards through the text. Active listening. Communication can only be successful if and when the speaker is sure that the message, opinion, explanation, or whatever it is has been fully understood, and that the response has shown that. In addition, giving someone the time to complete what needs to be said, and then having the opportunity to give your response, is equally important. Premature evaluation. Even before the communication is complete, some people start reacting to it and to frame their judgment and replies. Again, preconceived opinions and prejudices can easily get in the way. As we can see here, we need to develop our emotional intelligence and sensitivity. For example, when a person is feeling stressed or anxious, an expressed concern is more likely to be interpreted as criticism or signaling something serious. Constructive criticism made while an employee is emotionally fragile may be perceived as a personal attack. If possible, it's better to postpone a communication if there's a strong likelihood that the intended receiver will misinterpret it because of his or her emotional state. We all have the tendency to resist change for a variety of reasons: fear, unwillingness to take risks, losing control, losing status, not being consulted, not being appreciated, and much more. If change is introduced, the rationale should be made clear and explained slowly and carefully. People's feelings and worries need to be overtly and proactively addressed. Also, some oppose change even when faced with overwhelming evidence that it's needed, as they feel that they can't lose face and admit that they might have been wrong or mistaken in the first place. Cultural. It won't work here. Personal. Don't see what's in it for me. Intellectual. I don't get it. Lack of mutual trust. If people don't trust each other, the message will often not be followed, or there'll be gaps between what is said and what is actually done by a person, which will create lack of confidence in the other party. Selective perception. Being professional and objective requires us to stand back from our personal liking of or emotional reaction to a person, and to concentrate more on role, effectiveness, and the requirements of the job. Disinterested is a word which is often confused with uninterested, but which is another way of saying objective or neutral. Uninterested simply means having no interest. Information overload. We often have to convey large amounts of information, but it can't be absorbed or acted upon by others very quickly. Techniques to overcome this are shown here. Break up the message into more palatable or digestible bits. Reduce the amount of information that has to be absorbed at any one time. One technique is to make a high-level announcement and then follow it up later with more details. Adjust a message to reflect the various experience of the recipients. Before we go on to consider some of the solutions to the barriers to good communication, let's have a look at SBAR. The acronym SBAR, Situation, Background, Assessment, and Recommendation, is a structured communication tool that originated in large-scale organizations such as the nuclear industry and the military. It has increasingly been used in healthcare, particularly during handovers between staff or where a patient's care needs escalating. SBAR can be used in a number of ways, such as asking a colleague for advice or referring a patient to secondary or specialist care. There's a very good demonstration of this on the Healthy English website. This is part of the homepage. Go to healthyenglish.ddns.net. Then navigate to Communication Skills and Barriers to Good Communication, here on the left-hand side in the middle. And one of the 11 subsections is SBAR in action. That's the video. The 2 YouTube talks on communication are in the effective communication section. Finally, let's consider the 7 C's. Communication should be clear, concise, concrete, correct, coherent, complete, and courteous. This will help everyone become better communicators by selecting the message content and style that best suits the purpose and recipient of a message. It can be used to understand various things, and in our case, help everyone understand how best to communicate safely at work. When relaying a message to someone, being clear is very important. Jargon can be a big no-no. So don't use technical, medical, or business jargon unless you're confident that your audience is familiar with the terms. A clear communication focuses on a specific message rather than trying to achieve too much at once. Being concise means not being wordy. To be concise, you need to communicate what needs to be said clearly while using the least possible amount of words. Concise information is very important in effective communication. To deliver concrete communication, support your message with concrete facts, creating a more solid and convincing message. When sharing a message with someone, you must understand the facts and have checked that they're true. This can also require the use of proper punctuation, grammar, and spelling. A complete safety and health communication should answer 6 questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Like many structured conversations, the 5 W's and the H need to be addressed for people to fully understand the message. If you need an example, pull out any newspaper and read the first 1 or 2 paragraphs of an article. A good journalist knows this rule and includes all the information in the first few paragraphs. By explaining everything to the audience, there should be no questions needing to be answered. If your communications are not coherent, they will not be effective. To help make sure your communications are coherent, you should have a logical flow, and your style, tone, and language should be consistent throughout. In addition to making sure that each communication you issue is coherent within itself, you should also ensure consistency of message when delivering multiple communications. Being courteous when communicating is very important. This relates to the sender being sincere, polite, respectful, and enthusiastic. We've now come to the end of this second talk about communication. Good communication underpins everything we do in our working and personal lives. It requires great self-awareness, the ability to listen to others, and complex skills with language, verbal, non-verbal, and written. So finally, if you need a very simple guide to help you with all of those skills, this one is excellent. Listen. Really listen. Keep it short. Ask questions and listen fully to the answers. Notice body language. Play back and summarize. Thank you for watching and listening.